about Me Too. So just warning to everyone, we're going to be talking this morning about sexual abuse as far as children goes and adults. And as we were talking about this, we're keenly aware that this affects probably every single person in this room, either personally, either for yourself as a child or as an adult, but certainly as members of your family, your parents, your grandparents, brothers and sisters, someone that you know has been deeply touched by this. And so we're very aware of that. And we want you to know that you're not alone, that we have been praying for you, and we've been asking God to give us the right words and the right things to say this morning, because this is such a deep and sensitive topic, but it's so important that we talk about it as a church. So many times the church is kind of pushed to the side, or it's been pushed to the side in conversation in life. And we want to, the way that this ends is we expose it to the light. As painful as that is, and believe me, it's painful, and it's difficult, and it's hard, and it's disruptive, and it's all those things. But it has to be talked about, and that's how we put this to an end, by keeping it in the shadows and bringing it out into the open. So Becky's going to tell us a bit about Me Too and what that all means.
Yeah, so if you're not aware, the Me Too movement started in October 2017 with a tweet, which I think we've got, by Alyssa Milano. And she said, if you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, just write Me Too as a reply to this tweet in order to give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. And basically then what happened was that it just went completely viral. Loads of celebrities replied. Loads of people gave full details and disclosed the stories of the things that had happened to them. And it was like the world just stopped and listened, and we're like, actually, this is a really big problem, and we need to do something about this.
So we don't want to, if you've been paying attention at all to the news over the last few years, you know that the church is deeply involved with this as well. What's happened in the Catholic Church over the last few years, and finding out that priests abusing boys and girls all throughout the Catholic Church and then moved around instead of being dealt with. This continues to come out. In the States, it's done on a state-by-state basis, and there are 50 states. And I forget what the number is now, but recently Illinois, my home state, came out and they found hundreds of cases like this. North Dakota was just recently. And so these cases continue to come out. In the Southern Baptists in the States, the largest evangelical denomination, hundreds of pastors and hundreds of these cases have now come to light. And some were handled good and some were not handled good. And so the church, we are not immune to this. This is a part of life. And so I want to say we're not trying to push this under the carpet or say this doesn't happen or point fingers at someone else. This is something that we as a church, Big C, not this individual church. There's nothing going on right now. That's not why we're talking about it. It's part of this series. But the church in general has to face up to the realities of what's happening. And just to make everyone clear about what we're talking about this morning, we're going to go through some definitions of what we're talking about. And you may say, well, I've never heard this in church before. These are the truth in the church, and we believe in the truth, don't we? And so the things that we need to talk about are the things of the truth, not about a fantasy land and a fantasy world that we'd like to live in, but the truth of what you're dealing with, what we all deal with as far as life goes. So just some definitions here. Rape. Rape is forced sexual contact with someone who does not or cannot give consent. So forcing sex on anyone, if they're intoxicated, if they're in any kind of situation, they're able to say no, it's considered rape. Date rape. So that's sexual occurrences that are within a relationship, going on a date with someone. That is not, going on a date is not permission for that. Child molestation. So any sexual contact with a child comes under this definition and is wrong. So any examples. So anything like forcing a child to watch pornography or any kind of sexual suggestion or any of those kinds of things, anything sexual to do with a child is considered this and is wrong. Non-consensual sexual contact. So this is unwanted touching, groping, pinching, all those types of things we're talking about this morning. And then non-contact sexual abuse. So that's online, revenge porn, bullying, sexual suggestions, all kinds of other things that fall under a kind of a non-contact sexual origin. Those things are the things that we're talking about this morning. So some statistics. And maybe you've seen these before, maybe you haven't. But I think it's important that we see the magnitude of what it goes on in the world and what goes on in society. I mean, I would like to just pretend like it's not happening or pretend like it's not real. But it definitely is. So the statistics show that 1 in 3 girls are sexually abused before the age of 18. And so if that's you this morning, know that you're not alone, okay? Sometimes the feeling of being alone is the worst. 1 in 5 boys are sexually abused before 18. And so that's a lot of men, that's a lot of boys. And a lot of times those go severely underreported or not talked about because it's a macho thing or a manly thing, and it's somehow, I'm going to be made fun of, or I'm going to be, people are going to think I'm less of a man. But it very much happens to boys as well. 1 in 5 children are solicited sexually while on the internet before age 18. So parents, if you don't need another reason to monitor what your kids are doing online, this is a huge problem now online, and kids being alone and unmonitored online. Nearly 70% of all reported sexual assaults occur to children under the age of 17. 90% of sexual abuse victims know the perpetrator in some way. And this is also one of the problems with reporting and getting, because it's almost always someone that a child knows or a person knows and knows personally. And so they can sense and feel what's going to happen if they report it, if it comes out. And, when you talk about it, I don't have the statistic right here, but a large percentage are family members abusing other family members. And so when a person thinks about bringing that out into the public realm or getting that, then the thought of the family being ripped apart. And that's a huge deterrent. But it's almost always someone that a person knows or a child knows. 95% of sexual abuse is preventable through education. And 20% of victims of sexual abuse are under the age of 8. 38% of sexual abusers are boys being abused by females. And so, again, back to this thing, we're not just talking about women, although that's probably more of the emphasis. We're talking about boys as well and men as well. And so 90% of individuals with developmental delays or disabilities will be sexually assaulted at least once in their lifetime. And this kind of goes back to people with disabilities are often, mentally maybe they're like a child. And so it does make, when I saw that statistic, I was completely shocked. But then thinking about it, their entire life is almost like in a childlike state. And so when you think of 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys, it does make sense. And there are oftentimes a lot of carers and a lot of people around helping them. And so, and then the final one there is a typical pedophile will commit 117 sexual crimes in their lifetime. And so I've heard other statistics that say between 200 and 300 victims in their life. And sometimes a pedophile will molest or abuse or touch a child, and they may be so young or unaware that that's even happening. But this goes back to the reporting and getting out there. The big temptation, and a pedophile will always say this is the first time that's ever happened, and I'll never do it again when they're confronted. The first time I've ever done this, and the thing is, we cannot believe that. That is absolutely not true. It is a serial type of thing in someone's life. And so if you think, well, I saw this happen or this thing, and they said they wouldn't do it again, and it's not worth the trouble, you're not protecting. There are other children down the line that you need to protect and you need to think about, and not just the incident that you're with. But those are some quite shocking statistics to look at.
The thing for me that's really sort of stood out about the Me Too movement is the wider understanding and acknowledgement of sexual harassment and what that actually means. I think we've got it up on the slide. So sexual harassment is unwanted behaviour of a sexual nature which violates your dignity, makes you feel intimidated, degraded or humiliated, creates a hostile or offensive environment, and you don't need to have previously objected to someone's behaviour for it to be considered unwanted. And so the big thing about this for me is that when you understand that that is the definition of harassment, there are so many things that can fall within that category, things that you might not even thought about, things that might not affect one person but affect somebody else. And so actually it's about just understanding what harassment looks like is the key to then changing the behaviour. So when the Me Too tweeting thing started, my favourite tweet, which sort of summed up how I felt, was this one. Know what makes me angry? That my first thought about this movement was, but isn't that just all of us? And then my second was, well, which time? And that was literally my first thought about this. I just thought, as a woman, I feel like I've spent the majority of my life being, in small ways, sexually harassed. And not all of it's major, but inappropriate sexual comments or inappropriate sexual behaviour or just situations that make you feel uncomfortable or intimidated. And it's a slow build-up, and that's the thing that I think needs to be understood, is that it's not always one massive incident. Can be a slow process. And I just think that's a really important part of it, because so much of it is just ingrained within our society that we don't always necessarily recognise when it's happening. And I think, especially when it's happening to someone else, because you know what makes you feel uncomfortable, you don't necessarily know what makes somebody else feel uncomfortable. And so I think that it's about understanding, first of all, the definition of harassment, and then how it affects individual people. And when I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking about my experiences, and I was thinking, I can remember, when I was 13, 14, the first sorts of feelings of being sexually harassed. I know that when I was going to school, I used to have to get the bus, and I used to have to walk down quite a main road to get to the bus stop, and I used to get bibbed at and hollered at as I was walking from my house to the bus stop. And I mean, I was very clearly in my school uniform and underage, and still that behaviour was, a regular occurrence. And I was saying in the first service, I didn't realise that people didn't know this term, that when I was on holiday, when I was like 14, we went as a whole family, we made friends with another family, and one of the older men referred to me as jailbait. And I didn't know that people have heard this or not, but basically it's referring to a girl who's underage, who an older man could find sexually attractive and therefore lure them into, illegal behaviour. And I remember at the time not really understanding it, and I think my mum and my auntie sort of joked it off and then explained it to me later. But things like that are just so casual, and that's the thing, that's where it becomes dangerous. And I feel like that my story isn't anything special. It's something that all of us as women go through in a variety of different ways. Yeah. So
a little while back, there was a kind of a meme or something that came on Facebook where it talked about how a woman feels when, I'm talking to the guys now, how a woman feels when they walk down a dark street at night by themselves. And I saw that, and I said to Chas, I said, is this is this accurate? Looking for escape route, looking over your shoulder to make sure no one's walking behind you, grabbing your purse and all these, there's like 10 or 12 different things. And she said, that's exactly right. And so, guys, I think sometimes I've never thought, I don't think that way. I'm not really scared to be walking down the street, at night and unlit. But Chas, she immediately identified with that. And so, men, guys in this room, maybe you've never thought about that, but I think it's important that we talk to our wives, our sisters, our moms, our daughters, and find out what life is like. What's life like in these situations for you when you get on the bus and you see a bunch of guys and they're kind of, looking at you or, whatever. Hearing these stories from Becky, it brings it back to my mind. So let's be thinking about that, guys. The way we kind of process life and see life and put ourselves in the position of the women in our life. So we wanted to tell a couple of stories about things that have happened to us and kind of put some context to all this. When I was a young pastor, about 20 years ago, I pastored a church in a small town, 500 people in this town, and it was a small church. And one day, one of our trustees' wives came to me and said, I think my husband's abusing our boys sexually. Boys were 8 and 10 at the time. And she began to tell me what he was doing and all that. And, immediately it became clear that's what was happening. His father was in jail, actually, for abusing him and other boys. And so I had a choice at that moment of what to do as a pastor. Do we handle this internally? And there was pressure. There are people that think that's what we should have done. Or do we bring it to the authorities? Well, on Sunday he was in church, and on Tuesday I visited him in jail in his orange jumpsuit. And I'm the one that turned him in. I'm the one that wrote the statement to the police, and they went to his house and they found child pornography and all kinds of other things, and they went through the trial, and he served some jail time, and he ended up getting a divorce from his wife because part of that whole thing was he was never really repentant. His whole thing was, well, I haven't done as bad of things as my dad did to me, and that was his defense. And so, but the point of that story is that it was very painful. It was very difficult. I remember I had to call just about it was a very small church, just about everyone in the church I spoke to personally, and had to kind of, because it came out in the newspapers, our small town of 500 didn't have a newspaper, it was a regional newspaper, and in the small town news, there was our town highlighted, And my thought was, well, I'm going to show up on Sunday, and it's just going to be me and my family. No one else is going to want to have anything to do with this. But you know what happened? People rallied around. The church continued on, and we made it through that. And it was absolutely the right thing to do. As I've seen this scandals come out in the Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Church and in other, these stories on a regular basis that people knew about sexual abuse happening and they didn't report it. And 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years later, it comes out. And, I would be living in a lot of fear right now and regret if I hadn't said anything. But it was absolutely the right thing to do. And now these boys are in they're probably their late 20s, early 30s, and they're doing well. And so that's kind of my story of, it was painful, it was difficult, and it was for everyone involved, but it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, when I was trying to think about which stories to share, one of the things that I remembered was that, as a family, my mum has always been really great about talking about things like this. We've always had a really open conversation about things like this that go on. And I remember from quite a young age her telling me about an experience that we'd had as a family when I was very young, the church that I was sort of dedicated into. In a church service, it was announced that the pastor of the church had been having an affair with his secretary. But as this announcement was going on, women then around the church started to burst into tears, and it became clear that actually he'd been having relationships with several of the women in the church. And his response and his sort of defense for this was that he felt like God had called him like Solomon, and Solomon had many wives, and so therefore he was allowed to have many wives. And it's sort of funny, but it's sort of not, you know. And my mum was sort of in the car with one of her friends driving her home later on that week, I think, from home groups, and just saying, you know, isn't it crazy? Oh my goodness, can you believe this? It's so shocking. And the woman she was with just burst into tears and was like, I thought it was just me. I thought I was special. And my mum had no idea that she was even a victim. So it was just so widespread. And the thing that I think about this story in particular is that as a church, we need to be really mindful about grooming. And I think we talk about that often as adult to child grooming, but I think also we need to think about it peer to peer and leader to followers, and because these things happen over time and relationships just get a bit inappropriate, and then they get even more inappropriate, and it's very rare, I think, for stuff to just happen. It's always a slow build-up, and so we need to really make sure we're really good at just nipping stuff in the bud before it becomes a massive problem. And then the other thing I was thinking about is that I think what I wanted the men to understand in this church when we're doing this talk is that I just really want you to know that I don't feel, and I think I can speak on behalf of most women, that all men are predators, that all men are awful. I know some really, really great men who are godly and wise and loving and kind, but there are some men who are predators. And I think that as women, we don't necessarily know which ones are the predators. And often, it's the ones you least expect, and that's why they get away with it. And so as a woman, you live in this sort of state of having to anticipate that any man might be a predator, and therefore subconsciously trying to protect yourself and make sure you don't accidentally get yourself into a situation where you could get hurt. And it's only since I've started thinking about this movement that I've even realised that I necessarily do that, because it's such second nature to us of like David was saying, like Nick, my husband, goes running at night time all the time when it's dark, and he goes down all these country roads and doesn't think a second thing about it. I would never go running at night time on my own. I've been followed, I've been pulled people up alongside me when I'm running, and I've heard about awful things that have happened when women have gone running on their own, and so you just don't do it. You just think, okay, well, that's a potentially dangerous situation, I'll just avoid it. And we do this, we avoid stuff just in case. And so something like this happened to me just 3 weeks ago, actually. I didn't learn to drive until I was about 25, 26, and people were always really rubbish about giving me lifts anywhere, and I was so annoyed about it, because I was like, it might take you 10 minutes out your way, but it's 30 minutes for me in the rain. And so as soon as I could learn to drive, I was like, I'm going to be really generous with lifts. I want to make sure we always have a car with more seats than we have family members, so we can give lifts. And so that's something I'm really big on. And 3 weeks ago, I gave a man who I thought was my friend a lift home from work. We live on the same road, so it wasn't necessarily an unusual thing to have done. And when I pulled up outside his house, he grabbed me and he forcibly tried to make me kiss him. Even though I was sort of pushing away, he kept trying to grab me. Anyway, I managed to get out of the situation, but everything in me was like, crap, how did I let this happen? How did I let myself get in this situation? I didn't think this through. And then I sort of stopped for a minute. I thought, hold on, this isn't my fault. He knows me. He knows I have a husband. He's met my husband. He's met my kids. I've met his wife. I've met his kids. We live in a small community. But I think we do this as women. We sort of blame ourselves, and then with that comes shame. And even though it's not our fault, and for a moment I thought, I don't want to tell anybody about this, because everybody would be saying, well, you shouldn't have given him a lift home. You shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have put yourself in that situation. And I obviously did tell Nick, which is why I'm able to tell this story now. I did tell. And there was such freedom in telling. There was such freedom in naming it and being able to have, because I was so shook up about it, because it was so unexpected. And there was such freedom in being able to just share that with somebody. And I think that even though that's still quite low level, I think the pattern of behaviour is still the same for many women. We initially blame ourselves for getting ourselves into that situation. We then feel shame as a result of it, which then makes us not want to tell people because they'll judge us and tell us off. But actually, we need to break that stigma as a church, and we need to say, there is no shame. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that has to be recognized, that the whole nature of this sexual assault is that it's a power thing. And so it's one person, I mean, obviously it's sexual, but it's one person having power and dominance over another. And so it's not about the sex itself, but about the power thing, and that's where victims feel powerless and feel, kind of like helpless, and that's where part of that comes from. But just want to talk a bit about what the Bible says. I don't think anyone, I'm not going to try to convince anyone that the Bible says that all this is wrong, but just kind of give some context. Jesus had a lot of contact with women, and what would have been deemed not culturally right. Men and women live very separate lives. But Jesus had an interaction with a woman in Samaria, and this is just a little bit of their conversation. The woman answered him. She said, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying you have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." And what we see from Jesus is he doesn't condemn her, and he doesn't say, you're awful, immoral, adulterous woman. And I've heard this preached, and Becky and I talked about this, and other people as well. If you grew up in church, you might have heard this sermon as this woman was an adulteress, she was a scandalous woman. But in reality, for her to have had 5 husbands meant that she probably wasn't able to have children. And she was divorced over and over and over again in that culture, in that time, because she didn't have a husband. And finally, no one else would take her. And so she was living with someone outside of marriage. And I think sometimes our interpretation, our viewpoint of the Bible can be a bit skewed. So there's this incident, and then there's an incident where Jesus it says that he was, having meals with sinners and prostitutes, and what we need to be aware of is that these New Testament scandalous prostitutes, women, whatever, sinful women, they didn't get into this line of work because they chose to. They just thought it'd be a great way to live life and to make money. They were in this situation, either they were widows, or they had been abandoned or destitute, or or they weren't able to have children, and that's the only way they were able to survive. And we see this in Jesus, that he doesn't go around condemning these women, but he's very generous and is always on their side and gives them dignity. Another verse in the New Testament that we want to highlight is the verse when Paul talks about women in the church need to dress in a modest way. I'll put modest in quotations because the actual word there is more like appropriate way. And it has more to, it's talking about dressing in a way not to show off your wealth. Because if you read that verse, it says with gold and braided hair and pearls. And so the problem was there were people coming to church wearing all their gold and all their jewelry to show off and how wealthy they were. You did some research on it too, didn't you?
I did. And because I get quite annoyed about this, because I've been in youth clubs where the girls have been taken to one side and we've been told, dress modestly, you don't want to tempt the boys, and I've had that as a serious talk. And it just dawned on me, very recently, that I was thinking, well, yes, the Bible does speak about modesty for women, but it also speaks about it for men. There's also verses that say the same thing about men, don't wear all your gold. But also, not once when it's talking about women dressing modestly does it ever say, so that you don't tempt men. Not once. That is not the biblical motive behind that. But tell you what the Bible does say. In Mark 9, verse 47, it says, if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. It is better to go to heaven with one eye than to go to hell. And so that's how strong it is about looking and acting on temptation. But somehow, as a church, we've turned it into, don't tempt the boys. But the Bible doesn't say that. Sorry, is it me now? Here. So there's loads of women in the Old Testament who are victims, who have tragedy, who have awful things happen to them. And there's actually a really good podcast, if you want to look into it more, by the Bible Society, and it's called She Too, and they take you through some of the stories, and it's really helpful. But the one I want to talk about today is Hagar. So we know about Abraham and Sarah, and we know that after a really long period of waiting, Sarah has Isaac, and Abraham then has, descendants as multiple as the grains of sand in the shore. But before that, they get a bit impatient with waiting, and they get a bit frustrated that they're not having any kids. And so Sarah says to Abraham, "Take my servant Hagar, have a baby with her," and just offers her up like she's property, even though she's a person. And there's not one part of me that thinks that Hagar was like necessarily up for this. She didn't have a choice in the matter. And so this is the option that's put forward. And Hagar does get pregnant. And then rather than Sarah being pleased about this because her suggested solution works, she then completely resents Hagar, and she tells Abraham this, and he says, "Well, you just do whatever you want with her." And the verse says that Sarah then treats Hagar so badly that Hagar runs away out into the desert. And she's in this place of complete desolation. She's pregnant by somebody who now isn't going to look after her. And as we know in Old Testament, that almost is a death sentence, really. And she must be desperate. But then it says in verse 7 that the angel of the Lord found Hagar. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarah." So he names her, like Glenn was saying earlier. He calls us by our names. And what I find really interesting is that he says that you will name your son Ishmael, which means God hears. And then Hagar has the unique situation of giving God one of his names. And this is my favorite name of God because I feel like everything else flows out of that. She calls him El Roi, which means you are the God who sees me. And so in that time of complete desperation, God sees her. And not only does he see her, he meets with her. He sees her where she's at. And then he gives her a hope and a future. And actually, he gives her the same promise that he gives Abraham. It says that I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. So the promise that Abraham has about his nation, God then replicates that and gives that same promise to Hagar. And so that's the first part of this that I think is really important, is that when something like this happens, God sees you, God hears you, he's with you, and he still has a hope and a future for you. Now, the other part about this that I find really fascinating is that her son Ishmael is then considered to be the father of the Muslim faith, because Muhammad is considered to be a direct descendant of Ishmael. And so in Abraham's sin, there is great consequence. And so the families then of these two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, then throughout history have been in conflict with one another. And even today in Israel, obviously we all know Israel and Palestine are still fighting each other now, thousands of years later. So the other thing to take away from this is that there is always consequence for sin. So God doesn't just see and, meet you. There's always also lasting consequences. And we know that God is the judge and that God will deal with the situations in his time and in his way. And it's not necessarily for you to have to be the person to resolve it or be the judge, because we know that God is the judge and he will have the consequences for the perpetrator of this sin.
So with the numbers and statistics and just what we know, I'm going to say just a word to those perpetrators or people that are doing this. The Bible says this: if anyone causes one of these little ones who believes in me to stumble, it would be better for them if a large millstone were hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. God takes it very seriously when we cause one of these little ones, one of these children to stumble. It also says that you spread your sins out before you, your secret sins, and you see them all. And it says people who conceal their sins will not prosper, but if they confess and turn from them, they will receive mercy. And so what I want to say this morning is, if you are an abuser, if you are here this morning and you are tempted by child pornography, if you are going down that road, you need to get help. You and Jesus are not going to solve this, okay? I know you may feel sorry, you may have regret, you may not want to do it again, but unless you get help from outside source other than yourself and your relationship with God, you will go down a dark path and things will not get better. This is how sin continues to go on when we don't get help. And there are places you can get help, people that will help you. There may be consequences for what you've done. I don't know where you're at, but I want to say this: if you care about the people around you, the children around you, and the future of your life, you need to get help. You need to find someone that can make you and hold you accountable for yourself. And so these things will not go away on their own. It's something that has to be dealt with.
I also think as well it's really important that we acknowledge that there's freedom in confessing, that the enemy wants to tie us up in our sin and keep us there in that place. But even if you are an abuser or a perpetrator, there is still a future for you, but it has to start with confessing and allowing yourself to be freed from that sin that you've entangled yourself in. And we all do that. We all entangle ourselves within our sin. And it all starts with confessing, breaking free from that. And so I just also want to look at what the Bible says to victims. In Psalm 56 verse 8, it says, "You keep a track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book." And I love that imagery. I think it's so powerful. That's how precious we are to God, that our moments of complete sadness, He sees all of it, and he keeps a record of it, and it's important to him, and he acknowledges it. And then it then moves into Exodus 14 verse 14. The Lord will fight for you. You need to only be still. So God sees you in your hurt and your upset, and he is on your side. He will fight your battles for you. That isn't something that he makes you do yourself. And we were also talking about, where church leaders have covered things up, and, we've had sermon before about bad shepherds, really, people who don't shepherd God's people well, and what God feels about that. But to counteract that, in Revelation 7:17, it says, "For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes." And so we know that in eternity, it will be perfect, that we will have the true shepherd who will love us in all its fullness. And so we know that that's where our future is. We know that that is where we're headed. So there is always, always, always that hope. And then there were two things that I just really felt actually this morning about this. The first one is that if there is something like this in your family history, so if there's grandparents or parents or aunties or uncles or something like that, I felt like God just wanted to say to you that you are in God's family. So this isn't your heritage. This doesn't have to be your legacy. He is your inheritance. And so you can stop that cycle. It isn't inevitable. And the other thing is that if something like this has happened to you, that is not your identity. That is not who God says you are. God says that you are crowned like kings and queens with glory and magnificence. And that's how he sees you. No matter what's happened to you or what you've done, he loves you with a wholehearted love.
So we're talking about this morning because looking at these kinds of issues, the church, we need to be at the very forefront of this, not following behind and not making the headlines for the wrong reasons. But what an awesome, the church, and as far as a family goes, we have the opportunity to really to really lead the way in healing and help and bringing light to things and bringing truth. That's what we're about here, is truth. The church should be, we're people that believe the truth, walk in the truth, and live out the truth. And so we want to live out the truth in these areas as well. So just a few things that we talked about. And I want to say, like I've said every week, in this 30, 40 minutes that we have, there's no 50 minutes. There's no way we can cover every aspect of this, okay? And so if you leave here and you think, well, they didn't talk about this and they didn't talk about that, we want to continue this conversation, okay? There's no way we could cover everything this morning. But what we do want to say is this, that we need to take all allegations seriously. So it's extremely rare for a child to accuse someone of sexual abuse and it not be. It's extremely, for a smaller child, it's extremely rare. Does it happen? Yes. Can it happen? Yes. But it's very rare. So the default position needs to be that we believe them and investigate. And I'm not a professional investigator. If someone comes and tells me something, and I say, well, I don't know if that's crossing a line. I don't know if that's criminal. I don't know if that's this or the best thing to do is to take it to someone who does. Take it to someone, and there's risk involved in that, but to take it to someone who does know how to investigate and what the legal things are and where to take it from there. So we take all allegations seriously. Parents, with your children, school teachers, you're all trained in that, I know, but we take those allegations seriously. Number two is we need to make it a safe place for people to come and confess and to, obviously there's some shocking things that people may tell us, but we have to say that this is we have to create the safe environments for everyone involved. Number three, we have to protect vulnerable people in our care. Read that statistic today, about 90% of mentally disabled or challenged people in their lifetime are abused. We need to keep our eyes and our ears open, okay? In schools, at home, in other situations, yes, even at church. Keep our eyes and our ears open and be aware of what's going on and protect those. Many of us have people that are in our care, either in our jobs or in our families or in our homes or in our churches or wherever, and or if you're at the movie theater or you're at the shops. I mean, it just kind of, we need to have, those people are in our care and we need to be aware of what's going on.
We also must be really careful that our language doesn't victim shame, and so that could be completely unintentional, but we really need to think about the words that we're saying. So we talked earlier about telling girls to dress modestly. Well, that comes with a context of, well, if you don't and something happens to you, well, it's your fault. And we don't want to have anything like that going on here. We want to speak truth and life, and we want anybody who's a victim of anything to feel loved and not judged. And so we just really need to think about the language that we use and the lessons that we're teaching our young people particularly, because I know that I internalized a lot of that when I was growing up, that I had that responsibility over myself. And then the other thing is really that we need to create a culture here where, as individuals, we're in control of our own bodies. And so when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about my kids. So my oldest, my daughter, she has decided she doesn't like to be tickled anymore. She hates it. And she took me aside and she said, "Mummy, I don't like it anymore." And I said, "That's fine." And I've acted on that, and I make sure that nobody tickles her. And if I see somebody going to do it, I say, "She doesn't like that anymore." And somebody could say, "That's a bit much, it's only tickling." But I just feel like, well, if it makes her feel uncomfortable, we're not going to do it. But on the other hand, my son, who's younger than her, he absolutely loves being tickled. He thinks it's the best thing ever, and if all you did was tickle him all the time, he would think it was the best day. And so we just need to acknowledge that people are different, that different things will make different people feel uncomfortable, and there is no one size-fits-all thing for here. And we need to, because we are a family, get to know one another and have these conversations with each other. And if somebody says, "Oh, that made me feel a bit uncomfortable," respect that. That's okay, even if it doesn't make you feel uncomfortable. It's okay that it makes them feel uncomfortable.
And I think, a lot of this goes to talking to our kids. I have 2 teenage boys, and, this whole culture of respecting people's space and respecting people's bodies and their wills and their desires is very important that we teach our kids from a young age. And culture and things change over time. Joe Biden, I don't know if he's the former vice president. He's thinking about running for president now. He just came out in a long video because he has an issue with women and space, and you can go on, you can go online and see all the videos. But there may have been a time, whether he feels like a grandfather to people and that's why he acts that way is really not the issue. The issue is he's made women and people uncomfortable, and so he's acknowledged that. But he's almost 80, so he does come from a different time and a different era. But we need to be aware of other people and be control of the responsibility lies with us, not with like Becky said, it doesn't matter if a woman's walking down the street completely naked. That is not an invitation or an excuse for anything like that. Okay, and so control of ourselves. And then we shouldn't tell if someone comes to you or you have to forgive them, and you have to forgive them now. That's not what we need to tell people, because that puts responsibility back on the victim, that you've got to do something. You're doing something wrong right now. Now, do we believe that we need to forgive people? Absolutely. Lydia preached a great sermon a few weeks ago about forgiveness and about how forgiveness is a process. And the deeper the wound and the injury, it's like a physical injury. It takes a long time to heal. And so, we've heard, I don't know who came up with this, but this whole thing of time heals all wounds is absolutely a lie, okay? It's not true. Time does not heal wounds. I've talked to women that are in their 50s and 60s that were abused as children, and time does not heal all wounds. It's so, and oftentimes it continues to get worse. So forgiveness is a process, and we need to tell people that forgiveness is not something that we're going to make people feel guilty, or if they say, I just don't feel like I forgive, that we make people feel that way.
And we just need to be with people wherever they are on their forgiveness process. So if they're right at the beginning still, where something's just happened and actually surviving is all they feel like that they can do right now, like literally getting up and just living that day is where they're at, because that's hard right now, then as a church, we're with them and we stand with them and we support them exactly where they are. And then the last things for me to say really is to just let women be who they are. So as women, we're so different to one another. I know women who are like wonderful hostesses. They love nothing more than having people round and cooking, and I know women who are not like that at all and find it really stressful. And there are women who are really ambitious and, want to have a really great career. And there's women who want to stay at home with their kids. It's just ways of showing it that we're all so different. And so anything that says all women are like this is dangerous. And so the heart of this movement is to just get to know women and know who they are as a person, rather than thinking, you're a woman, so you're like this. And also just thinking, I just feel like there's been a real backlash from like lads mags being like, I don't even know what I can say to women anymore. And I feel like, well, ask them then, talk to them. See what is and isn't okay. We all know women. Talk to your mums, sisters, cousins, women at the church, what is and isn't okay. Let's just keep this conversation going and let it keep going, because stuff changes over time. I was saying to David, actually, on our old church, we used to have couples used to like to serve together. So like a husband and wife would serve in the kids ministry team together, until somebody said, well, hold on, if there's a disclosure, is somebody in a couple going to report on the other person in the couple? And we were like, oh yeah, we didn't even think of that. And so we stopped that and we changed it. And so we need to feel like, actually, this is an organic thing and stuff will change and grow, and somebody might raise something and we'll think, oh yeah, we didn't think about that. We'll change it,
So yes, just repeating what Becky said, we need to keep talking. So parents, dads, talk to your wives. Find out what's going on. Find out what it's like to be a woman getting on a bus with a bunch of guys, or walking down the street late at night by themselves, or how these different comments or little things kind of can make them feel. Talk to your kids. Talk to your coworkers. Talk to your family. It's uncomfortable. Believe me, we all are squirming in our seats thinking about it. But we need to have these conversations. We need to talk, and so we can see this come to an end. We don't want to leave you just with these things. We want to say that there is hope. There are people you can talk to. You can see up there, NHS, you can obviously go to them, NSPCC. There's different hotlines that you can talk to for victims. Even if it's a long time ago and you've never reported it, there are people that you can talk to. We want to assure you that here at the church, obviously we have men and women on the leadership team, and here at the church, a pastoral team, and you can come to us and you can talk to us, and we will listen to your story. We will help you navigate whatever the situation warrants for you to. There won't be judgment on you. There won't be, well, that's not a big deal, get over it kind of deal. We believe this is a serious issue that needs to be talked about and dealt with, and we want to help you in any way that we possibly can. We also want to say that you're not meant to deal with this on your own. The weight and the pain of sexual abuse is enormous, and you are not meant to bear that weight alone. You need to talk to somebody. There are safe people. There are people that are going to understand. You may be surprised that you talk to someone and they'll say, me too. 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys. So you are not alone. And if you've been abused or victimized or taken advantage of, or if things are ongoing right now, please speak to someone. And someone will be there to help you. Some will be there to pray with you and healing, but also help you get out of the situation if you're in that situation right now. And we want to, that is really what we believe is the answer. And so, any final thoughts?
When we were talking about this, we both said actually that we've both done Christian counselling throughout the years, and just how great it is. Like, I'm literally evangelical about it, because I think, I fully believe that God heals, and I think that he does that present day, but actually he also gives us tools, and I found such great healing for so many different things through Christian counselling. And I think that as a church, we want to formally say that it's okay to get help. Like, we're not going to say, well, just pray about it. Like, counselling is amazing. It's the best thing ever. So totally do it if you need to.
Yes, and I'm not a professionally trained counselor, and I don't know what level different people are, but we will help you find whoever and whatever help you need. And we want to be a part of the healing and the solution in finding, getting you back to a place of wholeness and health and being well. So I'm going to close in prayer, and let's pray. Lord, I just thank you. Lord God, I thank you that you're a healer, that you heal our physical bodies, but also the deep wounds that we have in our heart, Lord. And I thank you, God, that you're a God that weeps with us and sits with us and watches over us and calls us by name. And Lord, I just pray this morning for every person here, Lord, that has been abused or been a victim or it deals with this, and also our family members that maybe not ourselves, but people in our family, and the effects of that, or ripple effects of that, have affected so many, probably everyone in this room. Lord, I just pray for healing. I pray for hope. I pray for resolution. Lord, I pray for help. Lord, I just pray that that you would help us to have courage when we need to have courage and strength when we need to have strength, Lord. And you would help us and walk us through sometimes some very, very difficult things in life. Lord, we love you and we thank you. Lord, I thank you that we have a church that we feel comfortable enough to talk about these very difficult issues, Lord, and to be there for one another. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Well, thank you, Becky.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. And we want to continue this conversation. Life groups next week. And obviously in conversations and talking to one another, find a safe person if you need to talk to.